Hello everyone, today we will be building our final game, the Space Invaders game. This is a pretty popular old game. So we have some aliens and we have the shooter, and the aliens are approaching the shooter and we must just keep alive by shooting the aliens. So without further ado, let's just start by importing Pygame as PG, and let's initialize the Pygame module. Now let's start by setting the display set caption, and let's say here Space Invaders, and let's set the window to be equal to pg.display.setMode, and let's set it to 600 by 400. And now we will be building this game a little bit differently. We will be using object-oriented programming, so it's going to be a little complex, but we decided to keep this simple and just build it in proper object-oriented way. So let's define a class called opponent. So we will use this class to draw the aliens on the screen, and let's go ahead and do that. So class opponent, okay, opponent, and this let's define the constructor. If you don't remember how all this works, you should go back to the object-oriented programming lesson and just do a little review. So inside of our constructor, let's include the game x and y parameters. And now let's set the self.x position equal to x, and the self.game equal to game, the self.y position or y pos equal to y, and the self.size equal to 30. So this is the constructor that just sets different parameters like the x position, the game, the y position, and the size. So, and just keep in mind that game is an object from a class called play that we will just define this later. So for now, just leave it and you'll understand what it does later. So this is our constructor. This is called every time we initialize a new object of this type. So now we need a method, let's call it draw. And what this will do is it's going to draw pg.draw.rect on our window in this color, which is basically a shade of orange, so 255, 165, and 0. Okay, and we want to draw a pg.rect, and we need to use the self.x position and the self.y position as the starting positions of our rectangle, and this will be a self.size by self.size. Okay, so its size for now will be, for example, 30 by 30 if we don't change that. Now the self.y position is going to be plus 0.05. So one more thing, let's go ahead and also import the time and the random module. We are going to be using those later. So now let's go ahead and visualize it. So let's test our class. So let's set a number equal to 5 and a new list of opponents. So this will be blank. So now let's do for I in range number. So this will run once for every number we have here. So this will run 5 times. And now let's do x underscore mul for, and let's do random dot rand int between 1 and 100. And let's also copy this and change x to y. So we're just picking a random x and y multiplicator. So our opponents dot append. Now we're appending a new opponent object. So opponent, and now we're going to use none here. And now let's set the parameters. So game x and y. So for the x, let's do I times x multiplicator plus 4. And for the y value, let's just do I times y multiplicator plus 6. Okay, so now let's go ahead and print our opponent number. Let's print I and also create it. So this is just sort of a console debugging, so we know how we can get a message each time a new opponent is being created. And now let's do for I in opponents I dot draw. So for each opponent we're calling the draw method, and also let's do a pg.display.update and a time.sleep 10. Okay, so if we run the above code, you will see that we're just drawing randomly on our screen. So it just and it also displays the message here. Okay, so these are just randomly generated here. So now let's make the mechanism that makes the collision occur or detected. So now let's define a new method called check collision, and this is just going to have a game as a parameter. And in here we're going to check if our, you could say, bullet or missile dot x position is less than the self dot x position plus the self dot size. And also we need to check for all of the coordinates. So let's also check for missile dot x position greater than the self dot x position minus the self dot size. And now these are checking for the left and right parts of the alien. So now let's also add the missile dot y position less than the self dot y position plus self size. And finally I'm going to just add and missile dot y position is less than the self dot y position minus the self dot size. Okay, and now what we want to do here, if any of these if all of those actually are true, we want to do game dot missiles dot remove this current missile. And we haven't programmed the missiles yet, so that's why we get the red errors. Just hang on, we will program this in just a second. So opponents dot remove self. So what we're basically doing is if a missile collides with an opponent, we are deleting both the missile and the opponent, so they sort of like erase each other. So after that, our opponent class is almost complete, and then let's just program a gun class now. So let's go ahead and define a new class called gun, and now let's define the constructor of the class. So in the constructor, let's add also the game x and y values here, and the self dot x position underscore x position equals to x, and our self dot game equals game, and our y, self.y position equals to y, just like before. And now let's draw this. So define the draw method for this class, and now pg.draw.rect, and now we're going to draw on our window, and let's use the color black, so 0, 0, 0, if you remember the RGB values for black. pg.rect, and let's draw the rectangle, so self.x position and self.y position will be the beginning points, and this will be 8 by 5 in length and height. So this is the class for the gun object. So what we have to do now is let's program the launcher class. So the launcher will be generating our opponents. So we will pass in an object of game class to our launcher class, and it will generate our opponents. So our game class contains the list called opponents. If you remember, we set this over here. This here just keeps all of the aliens inside it. So whenever we want to print aliens on the screen game, we can just iterate through this container and print all of the aliens on our screen using the draw method. So let's create a launcher class and make it populate aliens inside of the opponents list. So let's go ahead and define here our launcher, and let's define the constructor of our launcher, or sorry, this should say class here. Let's define the constructor now, and this just needs the game parameter over here, and the margin now is going to be 30, the width is going to be 50, and you will understand what this does in just a bit. For x in range, margin game.w, or you could just do self.w minus margin and w here. So for y in range, margin and integer of our game.age divided by 2, and also our width. So this just does a game.opponents.append, and all it does is it just appends an opponent of the game x and y here. So now all we're doing here is we're creating the launcher, and we're sort of appending new opponents to it. So now let's go ahead and program the missile class. So class missile, and this will have a constructor here that will take as parameters the game, the x and the y. Now the self.x position will be equal to x, just like we've done many times before. The self.game will be equal to game, and the self.y position will be equal to y. Okay, now let's go ahead and define the draw method for this class. So draw self and pg.draw.rect, and let's draw here on our window with the color black, so 0, 0, 0. Okay, and now let's do a pg.rect, and in here let's just do self.x position, self.y position, and 2 and 4 here. So this is the width and height of our rectangle, of our missile. So after that you could just do a self.y position minus equals 2, so move the missile upward. Okay, so now let's program our play class. So we're done with the missile. This is pretty self-explanatory. it just defines the missile's details and it draws it on the screen with this method. So the class play here is going to be crucial. This is going to set the opponents to the blank list and also the missiles to a blank list. And also we're going to have a died boolean which will be false at the beginning. And actually now we don't need here these values now. So we need the aliens to be kept inside this here container. And similarly we need to generate and shoot the missiles inside the game. So we created this missiles list. And the died here is to check if our player is dead or alive. Now let's add a constructor so we know what the boundaries of our game are. So let's define this constructor method. So self.w will be equal to w, and let's actually give it here the w and h parameters. So self.h is equal to h, and remember this is just the width and the height. So self.clock equals pg.time.clock. So we're just defining a regular clock, and the done will be equal to false. So this just checks if we are done. So let's actually include our game loop inside of this method. So because we're doing the object oriented way, we have to actually keep the game loop inside here. So let's actually create a shooter of this will be a gun object, self w divided by 2 and age minus 20. So if you remember, this here is creating a gun. This is using the self as the game, so we're using this current instance, and this will be the x and y positions of the gun or the shooter. Now while not done, so while our done here is false, what we need to do is let's create a pushed variable, and this will be pg.key.getPressed. So this just returns a true or false value if we're pressing a button, and it also lets us know which button we are pressing. So if pushed pg.k left, so this is how we're checking. I'm just showing you a different way we can check this instead of the event handler. So if the pg.k left, our shooter.x position will be minus equal to 2. If shooter.x position is greater than 20, else 0. So this is sort of a shorter form of an if-else loop, if we just need to keep this in one line. And now let's do elif pushed pg.k underscore right, and now our shooter.x position will be plus equals 2 if our shooter.x position is less than w minus 20, else 0. So what happens here is we're detecting if we pressed a key, and what we're doing is we're adjusting the shooter's position to the left and the right, and we're just making sure that we don't go over the borders. This is all we're doing in this here part of the code. So now let's set up our event handler. So for event in pg.event.get. So now if the event.type equals to pg.quit, so if we quit, we need to set the done variable equal to true, and this will just exit our game loop. Else if I actually don't think we need any more events, so this is it for the event handler. Now let's do a pg.display.update, and let's do a self.update clock.tick, and let's set this to 60 frames per second, and let's also do a window.fill with a white color. So remember, the white color is 255, 255, 255. So finally, let's just do if not self.died. Let's just do a shooter.draw. So all that this means is if we're not dead, we're just drawing our shooter. Okay, so what we're essentially doing here is we're creating a gun class and a play class, and inside of the constructor method of the play class we initiate an object of the gun type called shooter. After that we iterate through the while loop to bind the left and right keys to make our shooter move on the X axis on the screen. So every time a key is pressed, the shooter's X position is decremented by 2, and if we press the right key, the X position is incremented by 2. So let's now do and we actually don't need this here, so let's just do if name equals main. Okay, our game will be equal to play 600 by 400. Oh, and this needs to be capital here. So actually we still need to define something so that we get rid of this error before we run it. So let's go back to our play method, to our play class, and at the bottom here we could just add 4 missile in self.missiles. We could do a missile.draw. Okay, so this just draws every missile we have on our screen. And finally, let's go ahead and add here a launcher self to initialize everything. And now, and actually what I forgot to do here was this needs to be inside a for loop. So for missile in game.missiles, let's do that. Okay, so that was the problem all along. I forgot to add the for loop over here. So okay, so I just figured out I have made a mistake here. So this is on line 16 inside of the class gun. I forgot to close the parentheses outside here, so just change this part. So now, as you can see, we have our little gun here, and we can move it left and right. We don't have any aliens yet, and we can't shoot anything yet. We haven't created the mechanism to shoot. So just this is to make sure it works so far. So let's go ahead and add more stuff now. So if we go ahead inside of our play here, let's first set the window to none. And then what else do we have here? Oh yeah, let's define what happens when we press the space key. So let's go to our event handler over here. Now let's do an else if event dot type equals to pg dot key down, and the event dot key equals to pg dot k underscore space. And I'm just doing this in a single one. If you had multiple keys to choose from, you could just have this else if statement, and then you could have this one underneath. But because now we just need to detect only one key, we don't really care about how we're going to do this. So and not self.died. So we need to press down a key. That key needs to be the space key, and we also should not be dead in order for this to be true. So what this does is the self.missiles.append, and let's create a missile object, self shooter.x position, shooter.y position. Okay, so we're creating a new missile object and we're appending it to the missiles list, and it has the shooter's x and y positions as the beginning coordinates. Now, let's also create another loop here. So for alien in self.opponents. So this will run every time for each part of the opponent's list. And it's just going to draw the alien. So alien.draw. Okay, so far so good. Now let's go ahead and run this. So we can see we have our enemies now, and we can start shooting them like so. As you can see, they are moving towards the player slowly, but we can't actually interact with them. They actually don't get hit by our bullets yet, or our missiles. So let's go ahead and define what happens now. Now let's just first let's add a part of our game loop that checks if all of the opponents are dead. So if the length of the self.opponents list is equal to 0, so essentially if there is no opponent left, if all of the opponents are removed or killed, we need to do a self.displayText, and we can say all enemies down, and we will define the display text later. It's just a simple displaying text method. And what else we need to do is let's check for the collision. So we already have the check collision method. We just have to implement it now. So after checking for each alien, after drawing each alien, we need to also check alien.check collision with self. So what this does is after we draw an alien, we're going to check for his collision. So if our alien.y position is greater than age minus 10, we can consider ourselves dead. So self.died equals true, and self.display text game over. So essentially what happens now is if we reach a certain y value, we consider ourselves dead and we display the game over text. So now what we have to do is we can finally say or define what this display text does. So let's go ahead and under here we could say define display text here, and this just has a text here as the parameter, and let's create a pg.font in it, and the font will be equal to pg font sysfont, and we can just do Arial 20 or 50 for something better, and the text area here will be equal to font.render, and this should have the text here a false. Let's write now a false value for this, and 255.00, so this will be red. And now let's do a blit or a window.blit, and let's paste this in text area. Paste this text area at these coordinates, so 110 and 160. Okay, so I think now let's add some more details, like let's go here inside of our play class under the event handler, and let's add a pg.display.update, and we can also take the tick here and add it over here and remove this display update now. We're just sort of making some corrections here. So another little mistake I found in the check collision method inside of our opponent is I accidentally put at the last end part, this needs to be greater than instead of less than. So let's go ahead and run it now. Now, as you can see, I can hit all of my opponents. So let's just quickly kill all of them. Okay. And there's one left. And now all enemies down, as you can see. So this is sort of a you win screen. And what I could do now is if I let the aliens touch me, so this will take a while. So as you can see, if the aliens touch me, okay. So this is a little bit delayed, so let's just fix that. I think what we need to do is let's go inside of our game loop. Okay. Now inside of our game loop, let's change our age -10 to age -50 here. So I think now that this will run as expected. So let's just wait a bit and see what happens. So now I think this will be good. Okay, so you can see that the game is over as soon as these touch me. Okay, I think it's pretty much done. Okay, so that's it. That's our game. You can go ahead and add any features if you would like to try and train yourself. And again, this is done in object-oriented programming. As you can see, we have everything inside of classes, and our own object here is the game that's running. So if you have any questions, just make sure you read this again and again, because it's not simple and we've not done many object-oriented examples before. So just read it and try to understand anything that you might have trouble initially understanding. And that's it for this course. This was the final game that we created. I hope you enjoyed learning Pygame. I hope it's actually something useful to you and fun. And I'll see you later.